So today we've got two more questions, and the first question we're going to be revisiting that old chestnut, karma, karma and rebirth. And the question goes, I'm having real problems coming to terms with the doctrine of karma and past lives, yet I'm told that it is central to Buddhist teachings. How can this be reconciled with a more materialist worldview? So it's three parts really to that question. And I think to begin with, we're going to start at the end of it. How can the doctrine of karma, be reconciled with a more materialist worldview? I mean, in short, it can't, because karmic is a non-materialist agency. And so philosophically, it cannot be resolved just using materialist explanations. And really, this is a part of the reason why in the West, secular Buddhism actually has dropped teachings of karma and rebirth from Buddhism. We have to understand, of course, that as Western Buddhists, we stand on our own worldview, and that worldview is nowadays, certainly in here in the West, is predominantly materialist. That is, that everything that can be explainable can be done through the processes, the function of matter and energy, as can be measured by us with our measuring instruments. And of course, this is a worldview that is adopted by, I wouldn't say by all of science, but certainly it's the prevailing view within science. And, there's a history to this particular worldview that starts with the Greeks, Democritus, who came up with the atomic theory, and that became very popular during the latter Renaissance with the early proto-scientists, people like Galileo and Sir Isaac Newton, and through that they became interested in what could be measured, because subjective experiences can't be measured. So, for example, people like Sir Isaac Newton began to define the colours of the rainbow in his optics, not by whether this was red or this was blue, but the angle of refraction that red and blue make when you pass a beam of light through a prism. Because how do I know that the red that you see is the red that I see? Those are subjective. But we can both agree that it's the same angle of refraction when the light beam passes through a prism. And so therefore, the qualities of things was split into two, and this is where the British empiricists came in, particularly people like John Locke. John Locke came forward and said, right, okay, those things that can be measured, those things that are measurable, which are objective, those are primary qualities. Those things which are subjective, which are only experienceable by one person, such as a thought, these are secondary qualities. And so the scientific method obviously became sought to tie everything to primary qualities. And so it is the same as well when we come to, when we fast forward now, when we come to practices like meditation and mindfulness. Of course, Buddhist meditation comes from a completely different worldview and a completely different time as well. And the purpose of that meditation and the purpose of the practice of mindfulness as well is not based on a materialist worldview. So therefore we have, for example, the Arhat path, the coming to the extinguishing of the passions, or we have the Buddha's enlightenment, the path to the Buddha's enlightenment, the Bodhisattva path. And this, of course, is also just a subjective experience. How do you measure enlightenment? How do you measure the extinguishing of the passions? The passions are an internally felt thing. So when it comes west, of course, when it comes into a materialist worldview, we are always seeking to measure up these subjective experience to objective qualities that can be measured. And so we are interested in things like a person's blood pressure, or the recurrence of illness, or the recurrence of addictive or depressive behaviors, because these are things that can be measured. And so these then take priority. Subjective results, such as enlightenment, which cannot be measured, these things then get relegated to something else. And so, because of our worldview, we are therefore sort of forced to walk down a certain path. The thing about Buddhism, though, as has been said, is that it is based on a completely different worldview. And personally, for this speaker, I think if we want to understand Buddhism, we really want to understand the teachings of the Buddha, then we have to at least be willing to suspend our own worldview and to immerse ourselves into something different, into a different worldview. Now, the Buddha was aware of this. Why? Because the Buddha himself had actually changed the interpretations connected with prevailing worldviews, which at that time were Hindu. So teachings like karma, for example, are not uniquely Buddhist. They actually come from Buddhism's parent religion, which is Hinduism. And karma literally means action, and it literally means an intentional or ritual action. And particularly for Hinduism, it meant that idea of ritual, that the performance of ceremonial and religious ritual was important, particularly when it came to securing a future incarnation for the deceased. So therefore it became very important that when someone died, the priest would be called in who would do the correct rituals. And if those rituals were done correctly, then the person would be guaranteed a fortunate rebirth in a future life. And this is what this was the view of karma. This was the view of the wheel of life. This is how the wheel of life worked through the use of ritual. So it wasn't a matter of personal ethics. That came later. In fact, this was the Buddha's own innovation. As Professor Richard Gombrich points out, the Buddha was something of a satirist, really. He was reinterpreting, and often in the teachings points out that he lightly mocks the teachings of the Brahmins, whilst at the same time co-opting them and reinterpreting them in a slightly different way. And what he does with karma is, of course, is that he individualizes it, he personalizes it. It became not religious ritual that determines future rebirth, but one's own ethical behavior, one's conduct that determines outcomes, that determines what we will become in the future. And so what the Buddha is doing by this actually as well is giving primacy to mind, to our intentions, because intention guides our actions, and our actions, if they guide what we will become in the future, then this becomes extremely important, whether we're going to end up in the miserable realms in some future life, or whether we're going to end up in a better place, such as arhats or Buddhas, for example. So Buddhism itself is not based, the Buddhist worldview, or the worldview that Buddhism is based on, perhaps unsurprisingly, is not going to be materialist. Materialism was very much a minority worldview. It did actually exist, but it was very much a minority worldview. At this time, the visible world was also just one half of the world. The other half of the world was the invisible world. And most religions have this notion of an invisible world that's populated by powers and spirits and deities, and so on and so forth, variously conceived, but this sense that there is something invisible impinging upon the visible was perhaps fundamental to all religious and spiritual movements in one way, shape or form. So unsurprisingly, we could say Buddhism also has that within itself. And if we look at the first verse of the Dhammapada, which declares that the mind is the forerunner of all states, now this usually covers all mental states, but all mental states are also seen as the way that the world is presented to us. And this is something that's really at the heart of Buddhism, that the way we see the world actually is the world. And so our use of imagination, the presence or absence of the passions, etc., the prevailing thought that we have, all these things have agency. All these things go towards making up the world. Perception is not just a passive taking in of information. It is in fact an act of creation. When we look and when we hear and when we touch, taste and smell, all these things are embedded in a mind or in mind that is structured and that is conceptualizing. And so that information is constantly being interpreted. And in fact, this is something that neuroscience tells us as well. So for those of us who obviously appreciate a materialist worldview, that's important too, to see that that's not something exclusive. So yes, Buddhism often actually is described as idealist, meaning that its view is more on subjectivity. But this is not a subjectivity as understood in Western terms. In materialist terms, because of the Cartesian dualism, the split between mind and matter. We see those things as being almost two separate realms that have some kind of weird connection between them that we're not really sure what that connection is, but that they obviously are. But actually in the East, those two things are not, they do not have that Cartesian dualism. And so the two things are simply seen as two aspects of one thing in that way. So Buddhism is seen as predominantly, or initially, the base of reality is not matter, but actually consciousness. For the Buddha, you can measure all you like, but if consciousness is afflicted and is deluded, then it doesn't really matter how much we measure something, we're not going to get to the truth of the matter. So just to summarize that portion, or this portion of the question, truth for a materialist is something that is measurable. It's something that is objective. Truth, as far as Buddhism is concerned, truth is always present, but if our seeing is not clear, if it's obscured, if consciousness is afflicted by delusion, by the passions, in other words, then it doesn't matter. Then we cannot see the truth. And once those delusions are out of the way, once they've been extinguished, then we have nirvana, then we see things as they really are. So we can see very clearly that philosophically there are two very divergent worldviews that are at interplay here. And we need to be aware of our own predominant worldview, because when we approach Buddhism, if we're coming at it from a different worldview, then there's going to be a clash there, and this is what this is obviously what the questioner here is feeling about this particular teaching. So moving on to the first two parts of the questions, I'm having real problems coming to terms with the doctrine of karma and past lives, yet I'm told it's central to Buddhist teachings. Yes, karma certainly is central to Buddhist teachings. Why? Because in the Buddhist teachings of the three signs of being, which hopefully we remember are the sign of impermanence, that everything is impermanent, all compounded things are impermanent. Those are the last words of the Buddha on his deathbed. That everything is subject to suffering if we cling to things, whether material or mental. If we cling to something, then because everything is subject to change, sooner or later we're going to suffer its loss. So therefore, that it becomes the second sign. And the third sign is that in fact, in truth, there is no self-nature, which means that there is no directing self that is organizing everything in this case. And this is the important thing. This is then when karma comes in, because our general view is that sitting here, if I suddenly decide I've had enough of making this podcast, I'm going to make myself a cup of coffee right now, and I switch this off and I go and make myself a cup of coffee, that I have decided to do that there is a self in me that has come to this decision and has abruptly decided to go and make himself a cup of coffee. That's what it feels like. In other words, this self has the agency, this self has the power to go and to make this decision. Well, the Buddha denied that. He said, actually, that's not how things happen. It's how they might appear to happen, but because we are deluded, because this is a delusion and this is a false view, we cling to it, even though we think that this is the way that the world works. Actually, it isn't. And that was the Buddha's revelation, the teaching of no I, what's known as the lion's roar of the Buddha. And so the Buddha therefore had to go on to explain how it was that that decision has been made, because clearly, anybody, if I actually got up and switched this off and went and made myself a cup of coffee, it's a fact. Anybody can see that decision has taken place. A choice has been made. But in the absence of an I, the question is left hanging: who or what makes that decision? And the Buddha's teaching of karma, rebirth rather than reincarnation, and what became known as the 12-link chain of arising due to conditions, the Praticit Samutpada, which is pictured around the rim of the wheel in the form of 12 pictures, which show the links of this chain. That's also known as the chain of becoming. This became the substitute. This became the Buddha's explanation for agency in things. And so what we have is not a one thing, not a unity. What we have is, well, there are several metaphors of it. What we have is almost like a rope, which is made up of lots of individual threads that are woven together. And they produce the appearance of a single rope, but actually they are made up of hundreds of individual strands that all go together, and each of those individual strands is also made up of sort of molecules and so forth that also form those strands as well. So what you have is lots of pieces, lots of elements. In fact, in Buddhism, this is given a word. This is where the term the dharmas come from. The dharmas are the elements of reality, and as the basis of reality is consciousness, these are the elements of consciousness, momentary effects, and that these effects are causal, or some of them are causal in nature. They have agency, and what gives them agency is the passions. The passions, and if you look at the 12 links chain of arising due to conditions, what you have there, as according to Vasubandhu, are 3 types of link. There are 12 links, and they always follow the same order. You have a causal passion, such as greed or delusion or grasping. And then you have the action that's based on that passion, on that klesha, which could be a body, speech, and mind. And then those two having happened, they produce a karmically potent result, what's known as a vipaka phala, which at some point in the future will ripen again and will give birth to a state similar to the state that caused it. So like produces like, the child has the resemblance of the parent. And this basically is what karma is about. And of course, because mind is seen as the substrate of reality, therefore it's reasonable to say that what we are looking at are mind habits here. Karma is the process by which mind habits are formed. And therefore, because the way we see things is deluded, if our karma is, if our actions are unskillful, then they will continue to be deluded. Whereas if they are skillful, then they will produce a more, they will lead to an erosion of the obstacles that prevent us from seeing things clearly. And once we reach sufficiently a state of seeing things clearly, i.e., where the obstacles are removed, then the truth reveals itself. The truth itself, though, is not dependent on karma, because the truth is the truth. As another saying puts it in the Pali Canon, whether or not Buddhas or sages arise in the world, the true nature, or the true nature is ever present. So hence the analogies, the oft-used analogies that we find all over the place about the truth is like the sun that's obscured behind the clouds. We can't see the sun, but that doesn't mean it's not there. And once the clouds have moved, then the sun shines, as it's always been shining, as it's shining right now, as I'm sitting here in a very rainy and windy London flat, looking out of the window on a very grey day. I cannot see the sun at all, although the sky is obviously illuminated. But there's no sign of the sun. But I know that above those clouds, the sun is shining and warm and bright, as it has been for, however many billion years, about 4 billion years, I think, or longer. However many billion years it's been shining. So this is, if we're looking for a sort of model as to how Buddha conceived the world and human beings and the process of becoming from past, present, and into the future, then this is it. This is it. The reason I said that there was no reincarnation, of course, is because reincarnation specifically relates to what's known as transmigration of the soul. And in Buddhism, there is that soul is some kind of essence of I. And obviously the Buddha denied that, anatta. Anatta or anatman. So obviously reincarnation is not so. What is reborn is the effects of karma. From a practice point of view, now obviously people are very interested in things like that when it comes to the idea of past lives and future lives, and I think the questioner who asked this question was somewhat critical and felt that in previous answers I've sort of sidestepped this answer, and I sort of sidestep it because I have no proof one way or the other. As far as I'm concerned, the jury's out. Past lives and is there life after death and so forth? I have my own view about that, but I cannot prove it, and so I don't see much point in sort of promulgating it on this podcast, when what I'm really interested in is Buddhism and Buddhist practice. What can be said is that there are plenty of Buddhists who certainly do believe very literally in past lives, like there are many Christians who believe very literally that when we die, there's a place in heaven, and so forth. That's a fact, and that has been a very prevailing view. However, what is also true is that is not the only interpretation. And this is something else that you occasionally run into, is people sort of say, oh yeah, but the Buddhism you teach, is that the Buddhism that the Buddha himself taught? And in some cases it is, obviously when we're teaching the Four Noble Truths, but when it comes to certain interpretations, no, probably not. Does that therefore make them invalid? I would argue no, that's not the case, because if you look at the history of religions, then you can see very clearly that religious teachings are not static entities. They move through time. Last week we featured as our book extract the Karen Armstrong book, A History of God, which is an excellent book, whether you believe in God or not. I think it's an excellent book to read, and she's a good writer anyway, because it gives that a very clear thesis that religions are not static. Obviously, it's primarily looking at Judeo-Christianity, with some Islam as well, but looking at the nexus of Middle Eastern monotheistic religions. And what is very clear, and biblical scholars are very clear about this, that in the early Old Testament, Yahweh was not the only God. In fact, in the Old Testament, there are talks about other gods. It's quite clear that other gods do exist, but that Yahweh makes a covenant with Abraham that he should be the predominant God to the exclusion of the others. Not that the other gods don't exist, but that they can be ignored, and that the covenant is just with Yahweh, and that it was only later on in the Old Testament, with the later books, that the other deities, the other gods, vanished completely, and Yahweh was the one God, as we understand it, monotheism to be these days. And then when we come to the New Testament, we can see again that the God has changed. The God of Jesus is different in many ways, in personality, style, to the God of the Old Testament. And so it is. And she, and even after the Bible had been compiled, God still continued to change, and she charts that right the way up to the present day through the God of the Catholics, and then the God of the Reformation, and the God of the, Protestants, and even to atheism as well, and the arising of atheism. And it's fascinating because it's really very, very clear how these interpretations have changed over time as our understanding has changed, and as the environment has changed, and culture changes, and the politics of the time changes as well, and requires a different deity. So religions have religious interpretations do change, and this is true for all religions. As we've seen, the Buddha himself reinterpreted the Hindu doctrine of karma, and that has subsequently changed as well. We have the rise of the Mahayana, which certainly is based on what has gone before, yes. And Mahayanists would argue that it's not different, but it is an amplification, an extrapolation, and therefore reinterpretations as well. So reinterpreting is nothing new, and this is how new schools arise and pass away as well, and other new schools arise as well. So to sort of cherish a notion that somehow what we need to do is to go back to some kind of primitive, pristine religion, is a sort of chocolate box, religion as things were in those days, is a bit of a misnomer and a great misreading of history as well. In fact, when we try to do that sort of thing, which is often what we have these sort of puritanical periods where we suddenly think religion has become over embossed and we need to clear it all out and just go back to the bare bones, as it were, back to basics sort of type thing. Well, even that is a modern reinterpretation of what the past times looked like. Interestingly, I mean, you can see this in the resurgence of interest in paganism, for example. Neo-paganism now is a religion that's recognized by the mainstream, and there are chaplains and so forth, so on and so forth. But I don't think anyone would seriously claim that this is the same paganism that our forefathers practiced, or that the Vikings practiced. For a start, early paganism was far more bloody than its modern recension, and the modern recension has much more, often plays much more of an emphasis, for example, on ecology and the environmental rights and so forth, and adopting a worldview that is less harmful to the environment, and has ethics surrounding the relationship between humans and the environment and the non-human world, or more than human world, as it's often described. So these are all modern interpretations as well, but they are extremely important because they reflect many of the concerns that we have now, that our forefathers who practiced paganism before didn't really need to bother about. They were much smaller tribes, etc. And their religion functioned differently because their needs were different. Our religion needs to function differently to reflect our needs and the problems that we currently face. So interpretation is absolutely necessary and real and valid when it comes to spiritual practice. So, yeah, that's a few more thoughts on karma. And I think I'm going to stop there because I've probably said enough on it for now. I was going to do a second question, but actually I think that's probably long enough for now. We'll leave that to a later episode. So just a reminder, if you want to ask a question, the Zen Gateway at gmail.com is the email you need to send to. And if you could just put troubleshooting in the subject line, and we'll double down on that and provide an answer. Okay, until the next time.